Hello, my fellow history enthusiasts, and welcome back to another deep dive into the legends that shaped our world. Tonight, we're embarking on an extraordinary journey through time, one that spans thousands of years and follows the most cunning, most adaptable, and ultimately most powerful family in the history of Westeros. A young trickster named Lann, armed with nothing but his wit and silver tongue, standing before the impregnable fortress of Casterly Rock. The Casterlys have ruled from their golden mountain for generations, their wealth beyond imagination, their power seemingly unshakable. Yet within a single generation, they will be gone, vanished like morning mist, and their name will be forgotten, while a new dynasty rises from the ashes of their empire. Fast forward 4,000 years. The field of fire burns with dragon flame as 55,000 men lie dead or dying, their dreams of victory consumed in an instant. King Tywin Lannister watches his world end in fire and blood, yet somehow, impossibly, his house will emerge from this catastrophe stronger than ever before. Jump ahead 3 centuries more, in the depths of Castamere. Ancient tunnels fill with rushing water as a 26-year-old lord orchestrates the most brutal lesson in power that Westeros has ever witnessed. The screams echo through flooded mine shafts, and from that moment forward, a simple song will strike terror into the hearts of anyone who dares challenge Lannister authority. And finally, witness the moment when that same young lord, now the most feared man in the 7 kingdoms, presents the bloodied corpses of royal children to a new king, sealing a dynasty's fate with calculated brutality and ensuring that golden lions will rule from the shadows of the Iron Throne itself. How does a family rise from clever trickery to absolute dominance? How do they survive dragon fire, civil wars, and their own catastrophic weaknesses to emerge victorious time and again? What is the true cost of such relentless ambition, and what dark prices must be paid for ultimate power? Tonight we follow the complete rise of House Lannister, from the legendary Lann the Clever to the ruthless Tywin, the man who turned gold into kingship and fear into absolute control. This is a story of adaptation and survival, of brilliant minds navigating impossible challenges, and of the understanding that in the Game of Thrones, you either win or you die. But there's something else here, something darker lurking beneath the golden surface. Because for all their victories, for all their wealth and power, the Lannisters paid a price that few truly understand. Every triumph came with a cost. Every victory demanded a sacrifice, and by the time Tywin Lannister stood as the true power behind the Iron Throne, his family had become something that even Lann the Clever might not have recognized. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get into your blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins in the mists of prehistory, in an age when the very foundations of the world we know were still being laid by giants among men. The Westerlands, that golden realm beneath the setting sun, was a very different place 8,000 years ago. Where Lannisport now spreads its bustling markets and busy harbors, there were only scattered fishing villages, where golden banners now fly proudly from countless towers. The land was divided among dozens of petty kings, each ruling their small domains from hill forts and wooden halls. But towering above them all, literally and figuratively, was the great rock that would one day be known as Casterly Rock. In those ancient days, it was simply called the Rock, and it belonged to House Casterly, one of the oldest and most powerful families in all of Westeros. For thousands of years, the Casterlys had ruled from their mountain fortress, growing rich beyond measure from the gold mines that honeycombed the very foundations of their stronghold. The Castellis were giants of their age, both literally and in terms of their influence. Some maesters claim they had the blood of the first men giants flowing in their veins, and certainly their massive frames and great strength supported such theories. They were warrior kings in the truest sense, leading from the front in battle, their golden armor glinting in the western sun as they rode out to crush any who dared challenge their authority. Their wealth was legendary, even then. The gold mines of the rock produced more precious metal than anywhere else in the known world, and Casterly ships carried their treasure to distant lands, returning laden with exotic goods and foreign luxuries. In the Great Hall of the Rock, Casterly kings held court, surrounded by more gold than most men could imagine. Their very throne was carved from a single massive nugget, and it was said that the light reflecting from their treasure chambers could be seen from miles away. For generation after generation, House Casterly seemed unshakable. Their mountain fortress was considered impregnable. Their armies were well equipped and numerous, and their treasury seemed bottomless. Neighboring kingdoms might rise and fall, but the Casterlys endured, constant as the rock itself. They had weathered the long night, survived the chaos of the Age of Heroes, and built what appeared to be an eternal dynasty. It was into this world that Lann the Clever was born, though the exact circumstances of his birth remain shrouded in mystery and contradiction. Some stories claim he was the son of a minor lord from the hills east of the rock, a clever boy who showed promise early, but was born to a family of little importance. Others suggest he was a bastard of noble blood, quick-witted but unable to inherit anything of substance due to his irregular birth. The most fanciful tales, told by bards and storytellers who care more for drama than truth, claim that Lann was actually the son of a trickster god, sent to the mortal world to upset the established order through wit and cunning. These stories describe him as impossibly beautiful, with golden hair that seemed to glow in sunlight and green eyes that could see into men's souls. They say his voice was so persuasive that he could convince birds to sing new songs and make flowers bloom out of season. What we can say with more certainty is that Lann the Clever possessed a mind unlike any other in his generation. Where other young men of his time might dream of winning glory through strength of arm or honorable deeds in battle, Lann understood that the greatest victories often came through understanding people better than they understood themselves. He could see the fears that men tried to hide, the ambitions they whispered about in dark corners, and the weaknesses they didn't even know they possessed. In his youth, long before he set his sights on Casterly Rock, Lann built a reputation throughout the western lands as the greatest trickster who ever lived. Stories spread of his exploits, each more impossible than the last. He supposedly convinced a group of bandits to rob themselves by persuading each man that his companions were plotting against him. He allegedly won a year's worth of free meals from an inn by betting the owner that he could make the sun rise in the west, then simply turning the man around to face east just before dawn. But these were merely practice for the greatest trick of all, the scheme that would echo through history and establish House Lannister as the true power in the Westerlands. Exactly how Lann the Clever conquered Casterly Rock remains one of the great mysteries of Westerosi history, with several different versions of the tale surviving to this day. The most widely told version speaks of Lann discovering secret passages into the rock tunnels and caves that even the Casterlys themselves had forgotten. Using these hidden routes, he supposedly infiltrated the great fortress night after night, whispering lies and spreading discord among the Casterly household. He would appear as different people to different servants, each time sharing just enough truth mixed with carefully crafted falsehoods to sow confusion and mistrust. To one servant, he might appear as a loyal guard reporting that he had overheard other guards plotting treason. To another, he would pose as a kitchen worker, claiming to have seen foreign gold changing hands in dark corners. Each lie was crafted specifically for its target, designed to exploit existing tensions and create new ones where none had existed before. Night after night, Lann worked his subtle poison into the very foundations of Casterly power. Servants began to distrust their masters. Guards suspected their brothers in arms, and even family members started viewing each other with suspicion. The great strength of House Castamere, their unity and loyalty to one another, gradually eroded as Lann's whispered lies took root and grew. Another version of the tale suggests that Lann's approach was more direct, if no less clever. This story claims that he somehow managed to seduce key women of House Castamere, turning their hearts against their own family through the power of his legendary charm and beauty. Whether through romantic conquest or simply through understanding what these women truly wanted from life, Lann supposedly convinced them that their interests would be better served by supporting him rather than their blood relatives. Yet another tale speaks of economic manipulation so sophisticated that it wouldn't be understood fully until Maesters began studying such matters thousands of years later. According to this version, Lann somehow managed to bankrupt House Castamere by creating false trading opportunities and phantom investments that gradually drained their legendary treasury. Through a network of false identities and fictional enterprises, he supposedly convinced the Castalees to invest their gold in ventures that existed only in his imagination. Perhaps the most fantastical version of all claims that Lann possessed shape-shifting abilities, either through magic or through disguise skills, so perfect that they seemed supernatural. This tale suggests that he could appear as any person he chose, allowing him to impersonate Castamere family members and issue contradictory orders that created chaos throughout their household. Guards would receive conflicting commands from what appeared to be the same lord. Servants would be told to do tasks that had already been completed by other servants following identical orders, and gradually the entire system of Castamere governance collapsed under the weight of impossible contradictions. Whatever the truth behind Lann's methods, the result was undeniable. Within a single generation, the mighty House Castamere simply vanished from history. Some stories claim they fled the rock in terror, abandoning their ancestral home to escape the madness that seemed to have infected every stone of their fortress. Others suggest they were driven out by their own servants and guards, who had been so thoroughly turned against them that they could no longer trust anyone around them. The most dramatic versions of the tale claim that Lann drove the Castalees to kill each other, that his manipulations created such paranoia and hatred within the family that they turned on one another in a final, bloody confrontation that left none alive to challenge his claim to their ancestral seat. However it happened, Lann the Clever found himself in possession of the greatest fortress in the Western Lands, along with treasure beyond counting and a strategic position that controlled the most important trade routes in the region. But more than that, he had accomplished something that would become the defining characteristic of his dynasty for thousands of years to come. He had proven that intelligence and cunning could triumph over seemingly impossible odds, that the right mind could overcome any obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it might appear. Lann didn't simply steal the Castamere name and seat. He transformed himself into something greater, taking not just their mountain and their gold, but their very identity. The name shifted from Castamere to Lannister, marking both continuity and change. He adopted their golden lion as his sigil, but where the Castamere lions had been symbols of raw strength and ancient power, the Lannister lion would represent something far more dangerous: intelligent predation, the ability to wait patiently for the perfect moment to strike. From the very beginning, Lann established principles that would guide his house for millennia. Cleverness was more valuable than strength. Adaptation was more important than tradition. Survival came before honor, and victory justified any method necessary to achieve it. These weren't the values of typical noble houses, built on concepts of chivalry and martial prowess. These were the principles of a family that understood power in its purest form. The early years following Lann's conquest were crucial in establishing the new order. The servants and guards who remained at the Rock needed to be convinced that their new master was legitimate, that his rule would be stable and beneficial for them. Lann approached this challenge with the same cunning that had won him the fortress in the first place. To the servants, He demonstrated generosity beyond anything they had known under the Casterlys. He improved their living conditions, increased their wages, and showed genuine interest in their well-being. But this generosity came with an unspoken understanding: their loyalty was expected, and disloyalty would be remembered. To the guards and men-at-arms, he proved that he could be a worthy leader by demonstrating his understanding of strategy and tactics. Though he might not have been the strongest fighter among them, his ability to outthink opponents made him invaluable in conflicts with neighboring kingdoms. Under his leadership, they began to win victories that had seemed impossible, conquering territories that the mighty Casterlys had never managed to claim. To the neighboring lords and petty kings, Lann presented himself as a reasonable alternative to the previous regime, where the Casterlys had ruled through intimidation and raw power. Lann offered partnerships and mutually beneficial arrangements. He understood that a network of allies was more valuable than a collection of conquered enemies, and he worked tirelessly to build relationships that would strengthen his position. But perhaps most importantly, Lann began the process of legitimizing his rule through marriage and alliance. He sought out daughters of other noble houses, women whose families could provide him with the connections and credibility he needed to transform from upstart trickster to legitimate lord. These weren't merely political arrangements. They were carefully calculated moves designed to weave House Lannister into the fabric of Westerland's nobility so thoroughly that removing them would become impossible. Through these strategic unions, Lann began the long process of expanding Lannister influence beyond the Rock itself. Each marriage brought new allies, new territories, and new opportunities for further growth. What had begun as a single fortress gradually became the center of a growing network of power that would eventually encompass the entire western region. The transformation was remarkable, not just for its scope, but for its speed. Within a single generation, the upstart House Lannister had become one of the most influential families in the Westerlands. Within 2 generations, they were the undisputed leaders of their region. And within 3 generations, other kingdoms were sending ambassadors to treat with them as equals. This rapid rise established a pattern that would define House Lannister throughout their history. They were not content to simply hold what they had gained. They were always looking for opportunities to grow stronger, to extend their influence, to position themselves advantageously for whatever challenges might come. They understood that in a world where power was constantly shifting, standing still was the same as moving backward. The legacy of Lann the Clever extended far beyond his own lifetime. His descendants would face challenges he could never have imagined, from dragonfire to civil wars to their own internal weaknesses, but they would meet each crisis with the same fundamental approach that had won them Casterly Rock in the first place. They would adapt. They would find clever solutions to impossible problems, and they would survive and prosper when other great houses fell into ruin. The golden line of House Lannister had been born not from ancient bloodlines or divine right, but from the understanding that intelligence properly applied could reshape the world itself. It was a lesson that would echo through the centuries, growing stronger with each generation, until the descendants of a clever trickster would stand as the true powers behind the Iron Throne itself. The centuries that followed Lann's conquest transformed the Westerlands from a fractured collection of petty kingdoms into something approaching a unified realm. Yet this transformation didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't come without bloodshed. The descendants of Lann the Clever discovered that holding power required different skills than seizing it, and each generation faced the challenge of proving themselves worthy of their inherited authority. In those early millennia, the Westerlands remained a dangerous place where survival depended on constant vigilance and careful alliances. The Rock might have been impregnable, but the lands surrounding it were vast and difficult to control. Dozens of minor houses still held their own castles and commanded the loyalty of their own sworn swords. Some accepted Lannister supremacy readily enough, particularly those who had profited from the new order. Others required more persuasive arguments. House Rains of Castamere emerged as one of the most important Lannister vassals during these formative years. Their red lion banner would become a familiar sight alongside the golden lion of their overlords, and their castle of Castamere, with its great halls carved deep into the earth, served as a secondary center of power in the region. The Rains understood that their fortunes were tied to Lannister success, and they proved themselves capable allies in the numerous small wars that characterized this period. The Tarbecks, holding their seat at Tarbeck Hall, took a more cautious approach to the new reality. They had been powerful in their own right before Lann's rise, and some among them never fully accepted their reduced status. This underlying tension would simmer for thousands of years, occasionally erupting into open defiance before being suppressed, only to resurface again in the next generation. The Tarbecks represented something important about Westerland's politics that the Lannisters learned to manage but never entirely eliminated. Further south, the Crakehalls of Crakehall brought military expertise to the Lannister cause. Their reputation as fierce warriors and their strategic position controlling key mountain passes made them valuable allies. Unlike some houses that submitted grudgingly, the Crakehalls seemed to genuinely embrace the opportunities that came with Lannister leadership. They understood that a strong overlord meant profitable wars and protection for their own lands. The process of unification wasn't simply a matter of conquest. The Lannisters discovered that their ancestors' gift for understanding human nature served them well in peacetime politics. Rather than ruling through fear alone, they learned to make their authority seem inevitable and beneficial. They invested in their vassals' prosperity, understanding that wealthy supporters were more reliable than impoverished ones. They built roads that connected distant parts of their realm, making trade easier and their own authority more visible. Most importantly, they began the systematic development of Lannisport as more than just a fishing village. The natural harbor that had served local fishermen for generations gradually expanded into something much more ambitious. Lannister gold funded the construction of proper docks, warehouses, and the infrastructure necessary for serious maritime trade. Ships began arriving from across the narrow sea, drawn by stories of Western gold and the promise of profitable exchanges. This expansion of trade brought new challenges and opportunities. Foreign merchants meant foreign ideas, and some of these concepts threatened traditional ways of doing things. The Lannisters showed their adaptability by embracing useful innovations while maintaining their essential character. They learned shipbuilding techniques from Volantis, adopted accounting methods from Lys, and incorporated military tactics from various free cities, all while remaining fundamentally a Westerosi house with Westerosi values. The long night, when it came, tested every principle the early Lannisters had established. Ancient texts speak of darkness that lasted a generation, of winter that seemed eternal, and of threats from beyond the wall that required every kingdom to contribute to humanity's survival. The Westerlands, protected by distance and natural barriers, might have chosen isolation. Instead, the Lannisters of that era demonstrated the strategic thinking that would characterize their house for millennia. They understood that their long-term survival depended on the survival of civilization itself. Lannister gold helped fund the Great Alliance that fought back the darkness. Westerland's warriors marched east to join the forces gathered at Winterfell and the Wall. The sacrifice was enormous, both in terms of lives lost and resources expended, but it established House Lannister as a crucial participant in the great events of their age. More importantly, the long night created lasting relationships between the Lannisters and other great houses that would influence politics for thousands of years afterward. Starks remembered Lannister loyalty during the darkest hours. Houses throughout the realm recognized that the Golden Lions had proven themselves when it mattered most. These relationships provided a foundation of respect that would serve House Lannister well in future crises. The period following the Long Night saw significant changes in Westerland's culture and society. The shared experience of facing existential threat had bonded the various houses more tightly together. Veterans who had fought alongside each other in the Great War against the Darkness returned home with stories that became the foundation of a shared identity. The Westerlands began to see themselves as more than just a collection of allied territories. They were becoming a people with common purpose and values. This cultural evolution accelerated when the Andal invasion transformed Westeros forever. Unlike many regions that met the Andal warriors with desperate resistance, the Westerlands under Lannister leadership took a characteristically pragmatic approach. They recognized that the Andals brought military innovations, agricultural techniques, and religious concepts that could benefit their realm if properly integrated. The decision to accommodate rather than resist the Andal invasion required careful management. Some Westerlands houses favored immediate war, arguing that their mountain fortresses could hold against any invasion. Others wanted to submit completely, hoping to preserve their positions under new overlords. The Lannisters chose a middle path that demonstrated their political sophistication. They negotiated directly with Andal leaders, offering alliance rather than submission. Lannister gold proved as persuasive to Andal warriors as it had to everyone else, and the prospect of sharing in Westerland's prosperity appealed to pragmatic Andal commanders. Rather than wasting lives in pointless battles, both sides recognized the benefits of cooperation. The integration of Andal military techniques revolutionized Westerland's warfare. Iron weapons and advanced armor-making transformed their armies from competent regional forces into some of the best-equipped warriors in Westeros. Andal castle-building expertise allowed the Lannisters to strengthen their existing fortifications and construct new ones that incorporated the latest defensive innovations. Perhaps most significantly, the adoption of the Faith of the Seven provided the Westerlands with religious unity that transcended political boundaries. The old gods had served well enough when each house followed its own traditions, but the Seven offered a common framework that could bind diverse peoples together. Lannister patronage of the faith helped establish magnificent septs throughout their territory, creating institutions that reinforced their authority while serving genuine spiritual needs. The Lannisters demonstrated their adaptability by embracing Andal culture without losing their essential identity. They learned to fight like Andals while thinking like descendants of Lann the Clever. They worshipped the Seven while maintaining the pragmatic approach to power that had always characterized their house. They built in stone while remembering the lessons taught by their trickster ancestor about the importance of flexibility and cunning. This successful integration of Andal innovations gave the Westerlands significant advantages over regions that had resisted more forcefully. While other kingdoms struggled to recover from devastating invasions, the Westerlands emerged stronger and more unified than before. Their military capabilities had improved dramatically, their economic networks had expanded through new Andal connections, and their political institutions had evolved to incorporate the best elements of both cultures. The final phase of this period saw the elimination of the last independent kingdoms within the Westerlands. Some fell through conquest, others through negotiated absorption, and a few simply faded away as their young nobles chose service under Lannister banners over maintaining increasingly pointless independence. The process wasn't always peaceful, but it was generally less destructive than similar consolidations in other regions. By the end of this era, House Lannister had achieved something remarkable. They had transformed a collection of feuding petty kingdoms into a coherent realm that combined the best aspects of First Men tradition and Andal innovation. Their authority was accepted not just grudgingly, but enthusiastically by most of their vassals, who had learned that Lannister leadership meant prosperity, protection, and the opportunity to participate in something greater than their individual ambitions. The Golden Lion banner that flew over Casterly Rock now represented more than just one family's success. It symbolized a political system that had proven itself capable of adapting to change while maintaining stability, of embracing innovation while preserving valuable traditions, and of building lasting prosperity through intelligent leadership rather than mere force. The foundations laid during these crucial millennia would support everything that followed. When dragons came to Westeros, when civil wars threatened to tear the realm apart, when royal dynasties rose and fell, the Westerlands would endure because their early Lannister rulers had built institutions and relationships strong enough to weather any storm. They had learned that true power came not from controlling territory, but from earning the genuine loyalty of the people who lived there. For over 4,000 years, the Golden Lion reigned supreme over the western reaches of Westeros. This vast span of time, stretching from the consolidation of Andor rule to the coming of Aegon's dragons, represents the longest continuous royal dynasty in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. While other realms saw kingdoms rise and fall, dynasties overthrown and bloodlines extinguished, the kings of the Rock endured with remarkable consistency. This endurance stemmed from principles established by Lann the Clever, but refined and perfected by generations of his successors. The Lannister approach to kingship differed fundamentally from their contemporaries, where other rulers relied primarily on martial prowess or ancient bloodlines to justify their authority. The kings of the Rock built their legitimacy on demonstrable competence and undeniable prosperity. Each new king inherited not just a crown and castle, but a sophisticated system of governance that had evolved over millennia. The Great Hall of Casterly Rock became famous throughout the known world for the efficiency of its court and the fairness of its justice. Kings from other realms would send observers to study Lannister methods, though few proved capable of implementing similar systems in their own territories. The secret lay in understanding that effective kingship required constant attention to detail. Lannister kings made themselves accessible to their subjects in ways that other rulers found beneath their dignity. They maintained extensive correspondence with their vassals, staying informed about local conditions and responding quickly to emerging problems. They invested heavily in infrastructure, understanding that good roads and reliable bridges served royal authority as effectively as strong castles. The military innovations pioneered during the Andal integration continued evolving throughout this period. Lannister armies became famous for their equipment and training, but more importantly, for their strategic sophistication. Rather than relying on the feudal levy system that characterized other kingdoms, the kings of the Rock developed something closer to a professional military establishment. This professionalization extended beyond simple military matters. The Lannisters created the first systematic approach to naval warfare on the western coast of Westeros. Their fleets patrolled trade routes, protected merchant vessels, and projected Lannister power far beyond their immediate borders. Lannister warships became familiar sights in ports from Old Town to the Iron Islands, carrying both trade goods and subtle reminders of Western military capabilities. The economic policies developed during this era established patterns that would influence Westerosi finance for thousands of years. The kings of the Rock understood that their legendary gold mines were valuable not just for the wealth they produced, but for the economic leverage they provided. Rather than simply hoarding treasure, they used their resources strategically to create networks of obligation and dependence throughout Westeros. Lannister banks, established in major cities across the continent, became crucial institutions for other kingdoms. Lords who needed to fund military campaigns, merchants seeking to expand their operations, and even rival kings facing financial difficulties found themselves turning to Lannister gold. The interest payments on these loans created steady income streams that supplemented mining revenues, while the political influence that came with being creditor to half of Westeros proved invaluable during diplomatic negotiations. The development of Lannisport during this period transformed it from a regional port into one of the greatest cities in the known world. Successive kings invested enormous resources in expanding harbor facilities, building magnificent temples and public buildings, and attracting skilled craftsmen from across the narrow sea. The city became a center of learning and culture that rivaled Old Town in its sophistication. Foreign visitors to Lannisport consistently remarked on the prosperity visible throughout the city. Unlike many medieval ports where wealth concentrated in a few districts while the majority lived in squalor, Lannisport demonstrated that Lannister prosperity extended throughout their society. Skilled workers lived in comfortable houses, public fountains provided clean water to every neighborhood, and the city's famous gardens made it one of the most beautiful urban centers in Westeros. This prosperity wasn't accidental. The kings of the Rock had learned that their own security depended on the contentment of their subjects. They taxed fairly, invested in public works, and maintained legal systems that protected property rights for merchants and craftsmen as well as nobles. The result was a level of social stability that other kingdoms envied but rarely managed to replicate. The diplomatic achievements of this era established House Lannister as the premier power in Western Westeros. Rather than pursuing conquest for its own sake, successive kings focused on building relationships that advanced their long-term interests. They became masters of dynastic marriage, forging alliances that extended their influence while avoiding the obligations that came with ruling hostile populations. The relationship with the Storm Kings provides the best example of this sophisticated diplomacy. Rather than engaging in the endless border wars that characterized relations between most neighboring kingdoms, the Lannisters negotiated a series of agreements that established clear boundaries and created mechanisms for resolving disputes peacefully. These treaties held for centuries, allowing both kingdoms to focus their resources on other priorities. Similar diplomatic successes marked Lannister relations with the kings of the Reach. The potential for conflict was enormous, given overlapping territorial claims and commercial competition. But the kings of the Rock consistently found ways to turn potential enemies into partners. Trade agreements that benefited both kingdoms, marriage alliances that created mutual obligations, and cultural exchanges that built personal relationships between noble families all contributed to a stability that served both realms well. The one relationship that proved consistently challenging was with the Iron Islands. The Ironborn culture of raiding and reaving created fundamental conflicts with Lannister interests in protecting trade and maintaining coastal security. Yet even here, the kings of the Rock demonstrated their strategic sophistication by finding ways to manage the threat without resorting to genocidal warfare. Rather than attempting to conquer the Iron Islands outright, which would have required enormous resources and might have failed anyway, the Lannisters developed a containment strategy. They built coastal fortifications that could resist Ironborn raids, maintained naval patrols that intercepted reaving fleets, and offered employment to Ironborn warriors who preferred service to piracy. Over time, this approach reduced the frequency and severity of raids while creating relationships with moderate Ironborn leaders who could influence their more aggressive countrymen. The cultural achievements of the Kingdom of the Rock era reflected the prosperity and stability that characterized Lannister rule. Casterly Rock became a center of learning that attracted scholars from throughout the known world. The Great Library, built by King Tywin Lannister, housed texts from Valyria, Jews, and the Far East, alongside the finest works produced in Westeros. Masters trained at Casterly Rock were highly sought after by other great houses, spreading Lannister-influenced ideas throughout the continent. Artistic patronage flourished under royal support. The Golden Halls of Casterly Rock showcased masterpieces created by artists from every corner of the known world, while local craftsmen developed distinctive styles that became famous throughout Westeros. Lannister goldsmiths in particular achieved legendary status for their skill in creating both beautiful ornaments and practical items of incredible durability. The religious policies of the Kings of the Rock demonstrated the same pragmatic approach that characterized all aspects of their rule. They patronized the faith of the Seven enthusiastically, building magnificent septs and supporting the religious hierarchy, but they avoided the religious extremism that sometimes plagued other kingdoms. Faith and politics remained separate spheres, with religious authorities focusing on spiritual matters while temporal power remained firmly in royal hands. This balance served the kingdom well. during periods of religious enthusiasm that disrupted other realms. When militant religious movements swept through parts of Westeros, the Westerlands remained stable because their people trusted that their kings would protect them from both secular and religious oppression. The Lannisters had learned that tolerance and moderation served their interests better than fanaticism or persecution. The military challenges of this era tested every aspect of the system that successive kings had built. Border conflicts, succession disputes in neighboring kingdoms, and the occasional ambitious vassal all required royal attention. Yet the kings of the Rock consistently demonstrated their ability to respond effectively to threats while maintaining the internal stability that was the foundation of their power. The most serious military challenge came from a coalition of petty kings who feared growing Lannister influence and attempted to restore the old balance of power through armed resistance. The war that followed demonstrated both the military capabilities that the Lannisters had developed and their strategic wisdom in how they employed those capabilities. Rather than simply crushing their enemies through superior force, the kings of the Rock divided the coalition by offering generous terms to any members willing to change sides. They used their economic resources to fund allies among their enemies' vassals, creating internal divisions that weakened hostile armies before battles were even fought. When they did resort to military action, it was swift, decisive, and followed by magnanimous treatment of defeated enemies that discouraged future rebellions. The lessons learned from this conflict influenced Lannister strategy for generations. They understood that military victory was meaningless unless it led to lasting political solutions. Defeated enemies who were treated fairly became loyal subjects, while harsh treatment created grievances that festered for generations. The Lannisters chose wisdom over vengeance, building a reputation for fair dealing that served them well in future conflicts. As this golden age approached its end, the kings of the Rock had created something unprecedented in Westerosi history. Their kingdom combined military strength with economic prosperity, political stability with cultural achievement, and territorial security with diplomatic influence. They had proven that intelligent leadership could create lasting institutions that serve the interests of rulers and subjects alike. The kingdom they had built would face its greatest test when dragons arrived from across the narrow sea. Everything they had accomplished, every principle they had established, every relationship they had cultivated, would be challenged by the arrival of Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters. Yet the foundations laid during these 4 millennia of independent rule would prove strong enough to survive even this ultimate crisis, allowing House Lannister to adapt once again and emerge from conquest stronger than ever before. The ravens that brought news of Aegon Targaryen's landing at what would become King's Landing reached Casterly Rock on a crisp autumn morning in the year 2 BC. King Loren Lannister, last of the independent kings of the Rock, stood in his solar reading reports that would have seemed like fantasies just months before. Harrenhal, the greatest fortress ever built, had been reduced to melted stone and twisted metal. Storm's End had yielded without a siege. The entire eastern coast of Westeros had fallen to 3 dragons and an army that numbered barely 11,000 men. For most rulers, such news would have prompted immediate action driven by panic or pride. Loren Lannister was not most rulers. 4,000 years of Lannister kingship had bred a different kind of response to crisis. He called for his maesters, his military advisors, and his most trusted counselors. If dragons truly commanded the power that these reports suggested, then traditional approaches to warfare would prove not just ineffective but suicidal. The discussions that followed revealed the sophisticated intelligence network that the Lannisters had spent centuries developing. They possessed detailed information about Valyrian history, including accounts of what dragonfire could accomplish against conventional armies. They understood the political situation in the free cities that had driven Aegon to seek a kingdom in Westeros. Most crucially, they recognized that this was not a typical conquest driven by greed or ambition, but rather the methodical expansion of a proven military system that had already demonstrated its effectiveness. Loren faced a choice that would define the future of his house. He could retreat behind the walls of Casterly Rock and hope that even dragonfire could not breach their ancient defenses. The rock was certainly formidable enough that such a strategy might succeed, at least in the short term. Alternatively, he could seek allies and attempt to match Aegon's small army with overwhelming conventional forces. The Reach commanded the largest armies in Westeros, and their king had already begun gathering his banners for war. The third option, immediate submission, was barely discussed in the initial councils. Loren was the heir to 4 millennia of independent rule, the king of the wealthiest realm in Westeros, and the commander of armies that had never known defeat. The idea of yielding his crown without even attempting resistance seemed to contradict everything his ancestors had built. Yet as intelligence continued arriving from the east, the magnitude of the dragon threat became increasingly clear. Aegon was not simply another conqueror with superior numbers or better equipment. He commanded weapons that rendered traditional fortifications obsolete and armies irrelevant. The mathematics of medieval warfare, which had governed conflict for thousands of years, had suddenly changed completely. The decision to ally with Mern Gardner, king of the Reach, represented a compromise between pride and pragmatism. Combined, their armies would field 55,000 men, the largest force ever assembled in Westerosi history. If conventional military power could triumph over dragons, this was their best chance to prove it. If they were doomed to lose, at least they would face their fate as kings rather than as defeated vassals. The negotiations between Loren and Mern revealed the complexity of medieval alliance-making. Both kings understood that their partnership was temporary, driven by necessity rather than natural affinity. The Reach and the Westerlands had competing interests in trade, territorial boundaries, and political influence that would resurface once the dragon threat was eliminated. Yet both also recognized that their individual survival depended on successful cooperation against this unprecedented enemy. The logistics of combining their armies tested the administrative capabilities that both kingdoms had developed over centuries. Moving 55,000 men, along with their weapons, supplies, and support personnel, required coordination on a scale that neither realm had previously attempted. The very success of this mobilization demonstrated the sophistication of the systems that Loren and Mern commanded, making their ultimate defeat all the more shocking. The march toward battle took on almost ritual significance for both armies. Veterans who had served in dozens of smaller conflicts found themselves part of something that felt historic even before it began. The sight of their combined banners stretching to the horizon created a sense of invincibility that infected everyone from the common soldiers to the kings themselves. How could any force, regardless of its exotic weapons, stand against such overwhelming strength? The confidence was not entirely misplaced. The army that gathered on the field that would forever after be known as the Field of Fire represented the finest military force that traditional Westerosi warfare could produce. Their weapons were expertly crafted, their armor was the best that gold could buy, and their training reflected centuries of military evolution. Under normal circumstances, they would have been unstoppable. The initial phases of the battle seemed to confirm their optimism. Aegon's forces, though well-disciplined and competently led, were vastly outnumbered and fighting according to conventional tactics that offered no obvious advantages. The Lannister Gardner army began to deploy with the methodical precision that characterized professional medieval warfare, creating formations that should have swept their enemies from the field. Then the sky filled with fire. Balerion, the Black Dread, Vhagar, and Meraxes appeared, as if from nowhere, their shadows falling across the battlefield like harbingers of a new age. The dragon's assault was unlike anything that Westerosi military science had anticipated or prepared for. This was not simply a matter of superior numbers or better equipment. It was the introduction of an entirely new category of warfare that rendered traditional tactics meaningless. The destruction was total and immediate. 55,000 men, the flower of two kingdoms' military might, were reduced to ash and memory in less than an hour. The formations that had taken decades to perfect had dissolved under dragonfire. The weapons that master smiths had spent months crafting melted like candles. The strategies that had evolved over millennia of warfare proved as useful as children's games. King Mern IX's gardener died in that fire, ending a royal line that had ruled the Reach since the Dawn Age. With him perished the dreams of southern independence and the hope that conventional military force could resist the Targaryen revolution. The House of Gardner, which had seemed as permanent as the seasons themselves, was extinguished in a single afternoon. King Tywin Lannister faced a different choice. Surrounded by the burning remnants of the greatest army Westeros had ever seen, he could have chosen to die with his crown or flee to fight another day. The decision he made in that moment of ultimate crisis would determine not just his own fate, but the future of his entire house. The retreat from the field of fire has been criticized by some historians as cowardly, but such judgments reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of medieval kingship. Loren's first responsibility was not to his own honor, but to his people. His death would not resurrect the fallen or change the outcome of the battle, but his survival might provide opportunities to preserve what could be saved from the disaster. The journey back to Casterly Rock gave Loren time to process what he had witnessed and consider his options. The rock remained unbreached, and its defenses might hold even against dragons. His treasury was intact, and his naval forces had not participated in the land battle. A determined resistance might last months or even years, particularly if other surviving kingdoms could be convinced to continue fighting. Yet Loren had seen enough to understand that resistance would ultimately prove futile. Dragons represented more than just powerful weapons. They embodied a technological and tactical revolution that had fundamentally altered the nature of warfare. Fighting against them with conventional methods was not brave but pointless, sacrificing lives and resources for no achievable goal. The decision to bend the knee came not from weakness but from wisdom. Loren recognized that Aegon offered something that no previous conqueror had provided: acceptable terms for submission that preserved local authority and regional autonomy. The Targaryens were not seeking to destroy existing power structures, but to incorporate them into a larger system under their ultimate authority. The journey to what was becoming King's Landing required considerable courage. Loren was placing himself entirely at the mercy of a conqueror who had just demonstrated his ability to destroy armies with ease. There was no guarantee that Aegon would honor whatever terms they might negotiate, and every precedent in Westerosi history suggested that defeated kings faced death or permanent imprisonment. Yet the meeting between Loren and Aegon revealed that both men understood the realities of governing conquered territories. Aegon needed reliable local administrators who understood their regions and commanded the loyalty of their subjects. Loren could provide exactly those capabilities if his submission was accepted and his authority was preserved within the new system. The terms negotiated during those crucial discussions established the template for Targaryen rule throughout Westeros. Loren would retain his seat at Casterly Rock and his authority over the Westerlands, but he would hold these as Lord Paramount rather than as an independent king. He would provide military service when required, pay appropriate taxes to the Iron Throne, and acknowledge Targaryen sovereignty in all matters of realm-wide importance. In exchange, Aegon guaranteed Lannister autonomy in local affairs, protection from external enemies, and integration into a larger political system that offered opportunities for advancement and influence that independent kingship could never provide. The Westerlands would become part of something greater while maintaining their essential character and interests. The ceremony of submission marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. When Lann Lannister knelt before Aegon Targaryen and formally surrendered his crown, he was not just acknowledging military defeat, but embracing a new vision of political organization that would reshape Westeros forever. The age of independent kingdoms was ending, but the age of the unified realm was just beginning. The immediate aftermath of submission revealed the wisdom of Lann's choice. Other kingdoms that continued resisting faced devastating consequences, while the Westerlands began adapting to their new circumstances with characteristic pragmatism. Lannister gold proved as valuable to the Targaryens as it had to previous allies, and Lannister administrative expertise helped establish the governmental systems that would govern the realm for centuries. More importantly, Lann's decision established a precedent that would define House Lannister for generations. When faced with impossible odds, they chose adaptation over destruction, survival over meaningless heroism, and practical advantage over abstract principles. These choices would serve them well in the centuries of Targaryen rule that followed, allowing them to prosper under the new system while maintaining their essential character and ambitions. The field of fire had burned away the old Westeros forever, but from its ashes emerged possibilities that no independent kingdom could have achieved. House Lannister, through wisdom rather than strength, had secured their place in this new world and positioned themselves to influence its development in ways that pure military conquest never could have accomplished. The dawn of Targaryen rule found Lann Lannister facing challenges that no king of the Rock had ever confronted. He was no longer a sovereign ruler, but a lord paramount bound by oaths of fealty to a foreign dynasty whose power rested on creatures that defied everything his ancestors had understood about warfare and politics. Yet within this apparent diminishment lay opportunities that would ultimately prove more valuable than the crown he had surrendered. The transition required delicate navigation. Lann's own vassals watched carefully to see how their lord would adapt to his new circumstances. Some among the Westerlands' nobility privately questioned whether submission had been necessary, pointing to the strength of Casterly Rock's defenses and arguing that resistance might have succeeded where the open field had failed. Others worried that Targaryen rule would bring foreign customs and unfamiliar obligations that would disrupt the stability they had enjoyed for millennia. Lann's response demonstrated the political sophistication that had allowed his house to survive and prosper through countless previous challenges. Rather than retreating to Casterly Rock to nurse wounded pride, he embraced his new role with characteristic Lannister pragmatism. He understood that influence within the emerging Targaryen system would depend not on past glory, but on present usefulness. The first test came when Aegon began establishing the administrative structure for his new kingdom. The conquered territories needed to be integrated into a unified realm, requiring systems for taxation, justice, and military service that could function across regions with very different traditions and capabilities. Lann volunteered the Westerlands as a testing ground for these new systems, offering Lannister expertise in governance to help solve problems that the Targaryens had never before encountered. This cooperation proved mutually beneficial. The Targaryens gained access to centuries of accumulated wisdom about effective administration, while the Lannisters positioned themselves as indispensable partners rather than reluctant subjects. Lann's willingness to share knowledge and resources demonstrated that former enemies could become valuable allies when treated with appropriate respect and given meaningful roles in the new order. The integration process revealed the extent to which Lannister institutions had evolved beyond those of other kingdoms. Their systems for record-keeping, tax collection, and legal administration proved so effective that Targaryen officials began implementing similar methods throughout the realm. Within a generation, approaches pioneered in the Westerlands had become standard practice from Dawn to the Wall. More importantly, Lann established precedents for Lannister involvement in realm-wide governance that would influence their house's trajectory for centuries. When Aegon needed advisors who understood the complexities of managing diverse territories, he turned to those who had demonstrated competence rather than those who simply possessed ancient bloodlines. The Lannisters consistently provided such competence, earning trust through performance rather than demanding it through inherited privilege. The establishment of King's Landing as the realm's new capital created additional opportunities for Lannister influence. Unlike Dragonstone, which remained primarily a Targaryen stronghold, the new city required participation from all regions to function effectively. Loren ensured that Westerland's merchants, craftsmen, and administrators played prominent roles in building the emerging capital, creating networks of influence that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of their territory. The Faith Militant Uprising during the reign of Ananise presented the first major test of Lannister loyalty under the new system. Religious zealots throughout the realm rose in rebellion against Targaryen rule, claiming that the dynasty's Valyrian customs violated the laws of the Seven. Many great houses faced agonizing choices between their traditional faith and their oaths to the Iron Throne. Loren's response revealed the careful calculation that characterized his approach to every aspect of Targaryen service. Rather than immediately choosing sides, he waited to assess the true strength of both factions while quietly preparing for either eventuality. This cautious approach frustrated some of his more impetuous vassals, but it reflected a sophisticated understanding of the political dynamics at play. The Lannisters recognized that the Faith Militant Uprising represented more than a simple religious dispute. It was fundamentally a challenge to the legitimacy of Targaryen rule itself, testing whether the new dynasty could maintain control when faced with organized resistance from within. The outcome would determine not just the immediate fate of Aenys Fist, but the long-term viability of the unified realm that Aegon had created. When Maegor the Cruel seized the throne and began his brutal suppression of the Faith Militant, Loren provided carefully measured support that demonstrated loyalty without excessive enthusiasm. He understood that Maegor's methods, however effective in the short term, were creating resentments that would influence politics for generations. By supporting the king's authority while maintaining some distance from his most extreme policies, Loren preserved Lannister flexibility for whatever might follow. The wisdom of this approach became apparent when Jaehaerys ascended to the throne and began the process of healing the wounds that the Faith Militant Uprising had created. The new king needed allies who had supported royal authority without becoming too closely associated with his predecessor's brutality. The Lannisters found themselves perfectly positioned to serve this role, having demonstrated loyalty to the crown while avoiding the excesses that had made other houses objects of suspicion or resentment. The reign of Jaehaerys marked the true golden age of early Targaryen rule, and the Lannisters prospered accordingly. The old king's policies of reconciliation and gradual reform created an environment where competent governance was valued over political connections or military service. This shift in royal priorities played directly to traditional Lannister strengths. Lord Paramount Loren's sons and grandsons found opportunities throughout the royal administration, serving as masters of coin, judges in important legal disputes, and diplomatic representatives to foreign powers. Their success stemmed not from favoritism, but from demonstrated ability to solve complex problems and manage difficult situations. The Targaryens learned to rely on Lannister competence because it consistently produced results. The economic policies of this era reflected the increasingly sophisticated understanding of trade and finance that characterized Targaryen rule. The unified realm created unprecedented opportunities for commerce between regions that had previously been separated by political boundaries and military conflicts. Lannister merchants and bankers, with their centuries of experience in international trade, became crucial facilitators of this economic integration. Lannisport evolved from a regional port into one of the great commercial centers of the known world during this period. Ships from the Free Cities, the Summer Isles, and even distant Yi became regular visitors to its harbors, drawn by the stability of Targaryen rule and the commercial opportunities that peace had created. The wealth generated by this expanded trade benefited not just the Lannisters but the entire realm, creating a virtuous cycle that strengthened both regional and royal finances. The Lannisters also played crucial roles in the cultural developments that characterized Jaehaerys's reign. The king's emphasis on learning and scholarship appealed to a house that had always valued intelligence over brute force. Lannister patronage helped establish libraries, schools, and research institutions throughout the realm, creating intellectual networks that enhanced their political influence while advancing genuine knowledge. Marriage alliances during this period demonstrated the Lannisters' growing integration into the broader aristocratic networks that governed the realm. Rather than limiting themselves to regional partnerships, they began forming connections with great houses from every corner of Westeros. These marriages created relationships that would prove valuable during future crises, while establishing the Lannisters as a truly realm-wide, rather than merely regional power. The military contributions of the Westerlands during this era reflected their transformation from an independent kingdom into an integral part of a larger system. Lannister forces participated in every major royal campaign, earning reputations for reliability and effectiveness that enhanced their political standing. More importantly, they learned to fight as part of integrated armies rather than as independent forces, developing capabilities that would serve them well in future conflicts. The approaching succession crisis that would culminate in the Dance of Dragons began casting shadows over the realm during the final years of Jaehaerys's reign. The king's difficulty in managing the competing claims of his descendants created uncertainty about the future that affected every aspect of royal policy. The Lannisters watched these developments with the careful attention that their survival had always required. The lessons learned during this period would prove invaluable in the trials that lay ahead. The Lannisters had discovered that prosperity under Targaryen rule required more than simple obedience. It demanded active participation in the complex political systems that governed the realm. They had learned to navigate court politics, manage relationships with other great houses, and position themselves advantageously within the evolving structures of royal power. Most importantly, they had proven that former enemies could become indispensable allies when they demonstrated genuine value to their new sovereigns. The wealth, competence, and reliability that the Lannisters brought to Targaryen service had earned them respect and influence that no amount of ancient prestige could have provided. They had adapted to conquest by making themselves essential to the conquerors. As the reign of Jaehaerys drew to a close, House Lannister stood in a position that Loring could never have imagined when he first bent the knee to Aegon the Conqueror. They remained lords of the Westerlands and masters of Casterly Rock, but they had also become integral players in realm-wide politics with influence that extended far beyond their traditional boundaries. The Golden Lions had not just survived the Targaryen conquest, they had thrived under it, positioning themselves for whatever challenges the future might bring. The death of King Viserys the Supreme in 129 AC plunged the realm into the most devastating civil war in its history, a conflict that would forever change the nature of Targaryen power and test every alliance that had been forged during the century since Aegon's conquest. For House Lannister, the succession crisis presented both unprecedented dangers and extraordinary opportunities, requiring them to navigate between competing claimants while protecting the interests they had spent generations building. Lord Jason Lannister embodied both the strengths and weaknesses that characterized his generation of Westerlands nobility. Handsome, wealthy, and supremely confident in his own abilities, he had grown up during the prosperous reign of Viserys Essos, when Targaryen rule seemed eternal and stable. The idea that dragons might fight each other, potentially destroying the system that had brought such prosperity to the realm, was almost inconceivable to men who had known only peace and gradual progress. Jason's initial assessment of the succession crisis reflected this fundamental misunderstanding of what was at stake. He viewed the dispute between Princess Rhaenyra and Prince Aegon II as a dynastic squabble that would be resolved through negotiation and compromise, much like the minor succession disputes that had occasionally troubled individual great houses. The possibility that competing claims to the throne might lead to actual warfare between dragons seemed remote and almost fantastical. This miscalculation influenced every subsequent decision that Jason made during the early phases of the conflict. When forced to choose between the competing claimants, he selected the Greens not through careful analysis of their relative strengths and weaknesses, but based on personal relationships and traditional concepts of inheritance law that would prove irrelevant once violence began. The alliance with Queen Alicent Hightower and her supporters appealed to Jason for reasons that seemed logical at the time. Aegon II was the late king's eldest son, and traditional Westerosi law supported male inheritance over female claims regardless of birth order. The Hightowers had demonstrated competence in managing royal affairs during Viserys's reign, suggesting that they possessed the administrative skills necessary for effective governance. Most importantly, from Jason's perspective, the Green faction included many of the wealthiest and most influential houses in the realm. Jason's commitment to the Green cause went far beyond mere political calculation. He genuinely believed in the righteousness of their claim and the inevitability of their victory. This conviction led him to invest enormous resources in their success, providing financial support that dwarfed the contributions of other allied houses. Lannister gold funded the equipment and supplies that kept Green armies in the field, while Lannister ships transported troops and materials throughout the early phases of the conflict. The scale of this investment reflected Jason's fundamental misunderstanding of what the Dance of Dragons would become. He planned for a short, decisive conflict that would be resolved through a single major battle or perhaps a brief siege. The idea that the war might drag on for years, consuming vast resources and devastating entire regions, never seriously entered his calculations. This optimism proved catastrophically wrong. The battle by the lakeshore, where Jason met his death in 129 AC, demonstrated both his personal courage and his strategic limitations. Leading from the front in the manner of ancient warrior kings, he fought bravely against superior forces but failed to achieve any meaningful military objectives. His death represented more than just a personal tragedy. It symbolized the obsolescence of traditional approaches to medieval warfare. In an age when dragons ruled the battlefield, Jason's twin brother Tywin faced very different challenges when he inherited leadership of House Lannister's war effort. Unlike Jason, who had approached the conflict as a military adventure, Tywin understood that the Dance of Dragons was fundamentally a struggle for survival that would determine the future structure of the realm. His response reflected the analytical intelligence that had always characterized the most successful Lannister leaders. Tywin's appointment as Master of Ships in Aegon II's government provided him with opportunities to influence the broader conduct of the war beyond simple military contributions. His most brilliant innovation involved dividing the royal treasury and hiding portions throughout the realm, denying Rhaenyra's forces access to the financial resources they needed to sustain their own military efforts. This strategy demonstrated understanding that wars were won through logistics and economics as much as through battlefield prowess. The decision to scatter the treasury reflected sophisticated thinking about the nature of medieval warfare. Tywin recognized that controlling King's Landing meant little if the city's wealth could be denied to whoever occupied it. By ensuring that significant resources remained available to support the Green cause, regardless of immediate military developments, he provided his faction with strategic flexibility that would prove crucial during the darkest phases of the conflict. Tywin's diplomatic missions during the war revealed the complex international dimensions of what might have seemed like a purely domestic dispute. His negotiations with potential allies in the Free Cities demonstrated that the outcome of the Dance of Dragons would influence politics far beyond Westeros. Foreign powers watched the civil war carefully, understanding that a weakened Targaryen dynasty might create opportunities for their own ambitions. These diplomatic efforts also highlighted the growing importance of economic relationships in determining political outcomes. Tywin's ability to secure foreign loans and military supplies depended not just on traditional alliance networks, but on the commercial relationships that the Lannisters had spent generations cultivating. Their reputation for honoring debts and maintaining profitable partnerships proved as valuable as their military contributions to the Green cause. The Ironborn raids led by Dalton Greyjoy created a secondary theater of conflict that tested Lannister resilience in ways that the main war never did. The Red Kraken's systematic devastation of the Westerland's coastline represented more than simple piracy. It was a coordinated campaign designed to cripple Lannister economic power and eliminate their ability to support the Green cause. The destruction was staggering. Fishing villages that had prospered for centuries were burned to ash. Merchant ships that had carried Lannister goods throughout the known world were captured or sunk. The coastal fortifications that had protected Westerland's trade for generations proved inadequate against the naval superiority that the Ironborn had developed during years of raiding and warfare. Yet even this catastrophe revealed characteristic Lannister adaptability. Rather than abandoning their coastal territories or attempting futile resistance against superior naval forces, they developed new strategies for protecting their remaining assets while minimizing further losses. Underground storage facilities preserved essential supplies from Ironborn raids, while hidden caches of gold ensured that resources would remain available for post-war reconstruction. The capture and torture of Tywin by Rhaenyra's forces marked the lowest point of Lannister fortunes during the entire conflict. His refusal to reveal the locations of the hidden treasury portions, despite suffering that left him permanently disfigured, demonstrated the commitment to long-term thinking that characterized his approach to every aspect of the war. He understood that short-term survival meant nothing if it compromised the foundation for future recovery. Tywin's treatment during captivity also revealed the bitter personal animosities that had developed between the competing factions. What had begun as a dynastic dispute had evolved into something approaching total war, where traditional concepts of honorable treatment for prisoners no longer applied. The brutality inflicted on captured enemies reflected the desperation that both sides felt as the conflict consumed resources and lives with no clear resolution in sight. The eventual triumph of Aegon II validated Tywin's strategic patience, but the victory came at costs that would influence Lannister thinking for generations. The Westerlands had been devastated by Ironborn raids, their population decimated by warfare, and their economic infrastructure severely damaged. The wealth that had been their greatest strength had been largely expended in supporting a war effort that achieved political success while creating enormous practical problems. Tywin's appointment as Hand of the King during the final phase of Aegon II's reign provided opportunities to influence the post-war reconstruction that would determine the realm's future trajectory. His policies reflected understanding that military victory meant nothing unless it led to stable governance and economic recovery. The challenges were enormous, requiring not just the restoration of damaged infrastructure, but the recreation of political relationships that the war had shattered. The transition to the reign of young Aegon III created additional complications that tested every aspect of Tywin's political skills. The new king was a child traumatized by witnessing his mother's execution, ruling over a realm that had been devastated by years of civil war. The regency government that emerged from this situation required careful management to prevent the outbreak of new conflicts between ambitious nobles seeking power. Tywin's continued service as Hand during the early years of Aegon III's reigns demonstrated the pragmatic approach that had always characterized successful Lannister leaders. Rather than exploiting his position for narrow family advantage, he focused on policies that would restore stability and prosperity to the entire realm. This approach reflected understanding that Lannister interests were best served by overall recovery rather than by attempts to gain advantage over weakened rivals. The lessons learned during the Dance of Dragons would influence Lannister's strategy for centuries. They had discovered that civil wars created opportunities for advancement, but also carried risks that could destroy even the most powerful houses. Success required not just choosing the winning side, but maintaining the resources and flexibility necessary to survive whatever outcome emerged from the conflict. Most importantly, the war had demonstrated the value of having multiple capable family members in positions of influence throughout the realm. Jason's death might have crippled Lannister influence if Tywin had not been available to assume leadership and continue pursuing their interests through different methods. This experience would lead future generations to ensure that their house maintained representation in multiple centers of power. The Dance of Dragons had tested every principle that House Lannister had developed during their centuries of Targaryen service. Their wealth, competence, and adaptability had all been strained to their limits, but they had survived and even prospered when many other great houses had been weakened or destroyed. The Golden Lions had proven once again that intelligence and flexibility could triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances. The aftermath of the Dance of Dragons revealed a realm transformed beyond recognition. Where once magnificent dragons had soared above Westeros, casting shadows that reminded everyone of Targaryen power, now only memories remained. The last dragon had died in 153 AC, marking the end of an era that had defined politics and warfare for over a century and a half. For House Lannister, this transformation created both challenges and opportunities that would reshape their approach to power for generations to come. Tywin Lannister's final years as Hand of the King demonstrated the remarkable resilience that had always characterized his house. Despite the physical and emotional scars left by his torture, he threw himself into the enormous task of rebuilding a realm that had been shattered by years of civil war. The challenges were staggering in their scope and complexity, requiring not just the restoration of damaged infrastructure, but the recreation of political relationships and economic systems that had been destroyed by the conflict. The Westerlands themselves bore visible testimony to the war's devastation. Coastal communities that had thrived for centuries lay in ruins, their harbors choked with the remnants of burned ships, and their populations scattered by ironborn raids. The great mines of Casterly Rock continued producing gold, but the mechanisms for transporting and trading that wealth had been severely disrupted. Roads needed rebuilding, harbors required dredging, and entire towns had to be reconstructed from their foundations. Yet within this apparent catastrophe lay the seeds of unprecedented opportunity. The destruction of rival power centers throughout the realm meant that those houses capable of effective reconstruction would emerge stronger than ever before. The Lannisters, with their accumulated wealth and proven administrative capabilities, found themselves uniquely positioned to benefit from the post-war recovery period. Tywin's approach to reconstruction reflected the strategic thinking that had always distinguished successful Lannister leaders. Rather than focusing exclusively on restoring Westerland's properties, he used his position as Hand to implement policies that would benefit his house while serving the broader interests of the realm. This dual focus ensured that Lannister recovery efforts received royal support while creating goodwill among other houses struggling with their own reconstruction challenges. The establishment of new coastal defenses represented one of the most important innovations of this period. The Ironborn raids had exposed fundamental weaknesses in traditional Westerland security arrangements, demonstrating that even the wealthiest territories could be devastated by enemies with superior naval capabilities. Tywin's response involved creating an integrated system of fortifications, warning signals, and rapid response forces that could protect the coastline against future threats. These defensive improvements incorporated lessons learned not just from the recent war, but from centuries of Lannister experience in managing external threats. The new fortifications were designed to complement each other rather than functioning as isolated strongpoints, creating overlapping fields of fire and mutual support networks that would make future raids far more costly for potential attackers. Early warning systems using signal fires and messenger networks ensured that threats could be identified and countered before they could cause serious damage. The economic policies implemented during this reconstruction period established patterns that would influence Westerland's prosperity for generations. Rather than simply rebuilding existing industries and trade networks, Thailand encouraged innovation and diversification that reduced dependence on any single source of wealth. New mines were opened to supplement the traditional gold production of Casterly Rock, while alternative trade routes were developed to reduce vulnerability to naval disruption. The expansion of Lannisport during this era transformed it from a regional port into one of the great commercial centers of the known world. The harbor facilities were completely redesigned to accommodate larger ships and greater volumes of trade, while new districts were constructed to house the merchants, craftsmen, and laborers who flocked to participate in the economic boom that accompanied reconstruction efforts. These urban improvements reflected sophisticated understanding of the relationship between infrastructure and economic growth. Wide streets facilitated the movement of goods and people, while proper sewers and water systems created healthier living conditions that attracted skilled workers from throughout the realm. Public buildings and spaces enhanced the city's reputation, while providing practical benefits that supported commercial activities. The cultural developments of this period demonstrated Lannister understanding that reconstruction required more than just physical restoration. The traumas of civil war had left deep psychological scars throughout the realm, creating social tensions that threatened future stability. Thailand's response involved patronizing arts, scholarship, and religious activities that helped heal these wounds while enhancing Lannister prestige. The Great Library, established at Casterly Rock during this period, became one of the premier centers of learning in Westeros. Manuscripts saved from destruction during the war were supplemented by new acquisitions from throughout the known world, creating a collection that attracted scholars from as far away as the Free Cities and the Summer Isles. This investment in intellectual resources provided practical benefits by improving administrative capabilities while demonstrating Lannister commitment to civilization and progress. Religious patronage during the Reconstruction period reflected the delicate balance that characterized all aspects of Lannister policy. The faith of the Seven had been traumatized by the religious conflicts that had accompanied the Dance of Dragons, requiring careful management to prevent the outbreak of new sectarian violence. Thailand's approach involved supporting moderate religious leaders who preached reconciliation and healing, rather than those who sought to perpetuate old grievances. The magnificent sept constructed in Lannisport during this era symbolized this approach to religious policy. Its architecture incorporated elements from throughout the realm, demonstrating that unity and diversity could coexist successfully. The sept's dedication ceremony brought together religious leaders from every region of Westeros, creating opportunities for dialogue and cooperation that helped heal the divisions created by war. Military innovations developed during this period reflected lessons learned from both the Dance of Dragons and the Ironborn raids. Traditional feudal levy systems had proven inadequate for the complex challenges of civil war, while conventional fortifications had failed against new types of threats. Thailand's response involved creating more professional military establishments that could respond effectively to diverse challenges. The new Lannister military forces combined traditional strengths with innovative approaches developed in response to recent experiences. Heavy cavalry remained important for conventional battlefield operations, but these forces were supplemented by specialized units trained for coastal defense, siege warfare, and rapid response operations. This diversification ensured that future Lannister armies would be prepared for whatever challenges they might face. Naval capabilities received particular attention during this Reconstruction period. The Ironborn raids had demonstrated that control of the seas was essential for protecting Westerland's interests, requiring investment in ships and sailors that went far beyond traditional requirements. The new Lannister fleet incorporated design innovations learned from captured Ironborn vessels while maintaining the reliability and effectiveness that characterized all Lannister military equipment. The intelligence networks established during this period represented perhaps the most important innovation of the entire reconstruction effort. The Dance of Dragons had demonstrated that political survival required advance warning of developing threats, while the Ironborn raids had shown the importance of understanding enemy capabilities and intentions. Tywin's response involved creating systematic information-gathering systems that extended throughout the realm and beyond. These intelligence operations provided benefits that extended far beyond simple military applications. Commercial intelligence about trade opportunities and market conditions helped Lannister merchants maintain their competitive advantages, while political intelligence about court developments and noble house relationships allowed for more effective diplomatic strategies. The investment in information proved as valuable as any physical reconstruction project. The transition from Tywin's leadership to the next generation of Lannister lords occurred gradually during the final years of his life. His experiences during the Dance of Dragons had convinced him that House Lannister's long-term survival required multiple capable leaders rather than dependence on any single individual. The training and preparation of his successors reflected this understanding, ensuring continuity of leadership during the challenging decades that lay ahead. The death of Tywin Lannister in 157 AC marked the end of an era for both his house and the realm as a whole. His funeral attracted representatives from throughout Westeros, demonstrating the respect he had earned through decades of competent service during some of the most difficult periods in the realm's history. Yet his greatest legacy lay not in personal recognition, but in the institutions and relationships he had created to ensure that House Lannister would continue prospering regardless of future challenges. The Westerlands that emerged from this reconstruction period bore little resemblance to the war-torn region that had existed just a few decades earlier. Stronger, wealthier, and more sophisticated than ever before, they represented the successful application of traditional Lannister principles to unprecedented challenges. The Golden Lions had once again demonstrated their ability to adapt and prosper under even the most difficult circumstances. As the realm entered the long period of relative peace that characterized the later Targaryen period, House Lannister found itself in a position that previous generations could hardly have imagined. They had survived the greatest civil war in Westerosi history, rebuilt their strength from the foundations upward, and established themselves as indispensable participants in realm-wide governance. The stage was set for continued growth and influence that would ultimately make them the power behind the Iron Throne itself. The legitimization of Aegon Thor's bastards in 184 AC created a crisis that would plague the realm for over 7 decades. When the unworthy king lay dying, his decision to legitimize all his natural children seemed like a final act of spite against a son he had never loved. Yet this deathbed proclamation would unleash consequences that reached far beyond royal family politics, testing the loyalty of every great house and creating opportunities for ambitious men to reshape the very foundations of Targaryen rule. Daemon Blackfyre embodied everything that his half-brother Daemon II was not. Where the legitimate king was scholarly and cautious, Daemon possessed the natural charisma and martial prowess that stirred men's hearts and inspired absolute devotion. His physical presence alone commanded attention, standing tall and powerful with the silver-gold hair and purple eyes that marked him unmistakably as Aegon IV's son. More importantly, he wielded Blackfyre, the Valyrian steel sword that had belonged to Aegon the Conqueror himself, a weapon that many viewed as a symbol of legitimate royal authority. The sword's significance cannot be overstated in understanding the crisis that followed. Aegon IV had given Blackfyre to his bastard rather than his heir, a gesture that spoke volumes about his feelings toward both sons. In a society where symbols carried enormous weight, this transfer suggested royal favor that transcended the technicalities of birth order. Many nobles who might otherwise have dismissed Daemon's claims found themselves wondering whether the late king had intended something more than simple legitimization. The lords of the Westerlands faced a dilemma that cut to the heart of their relationship with the Targaryen dynasty. For nearly 2 centuries, House Lannister had prospered through unwavering loyalty to legitimate royal authority. This consistency had earned them respect, influence, and prosperity that made them one of the most powerful houses in the realm. Yet the succession crisis created by Aegon IV's actions threatened to destroy the very concept of legitimate authority that had served them so well. The Lannister analysis of the competing claims revealed the sophisticated political thinking that had always characterized their approach to major decisions. Daemon Blackfyre possessed considerable advantages beyond his personal charisma and symbolic weapons. He commanded the loyalty of numerous powerful houses who had grown dissatisfied with Daeron II's policies, particularly his attempts to integrate Dorne into the realm through marriage rather than conquest. Many nobles viewed this approach as weakness, preferring the aggressive expansion that had characterized earlier Targaryen reigns. Yet these apparent advantages were balanced by significant weaknesses that careful analysis revealed. Daemon's support came primarily from houses that had their own grievances against royal policy rather than genuine commitment to his cause. His military capabilities, while impressive, had never been tested in large-scale warfare against competent opposition. Most importantly, his rebellion would require overturning established succession laws that had governed the realm for generations. The Lannisters understood that supporting Daemon would mean gambling everything they had built on the uncertain outcome of civil war. Even if Daemon won, there was no guarantee that he would prove a competent ruler or that his victory would lead to the stability and prosperity that had made their loyalty profitable. Conversely, supporting Daemon meant backing a king whose legitimacy was unquestioned by law, even if his personal qualities seemed less inspiring than his half-brothers. The decision to support the legitimate Targaryen line reflected not just legal principles, but practical calculation about long-term consequences. The Lannisters recognized that accepting Daemon's claims would establish dangerous precedents that could destabilize the realm for generations. If bastards could claim thrones based on personal charisma and symbolic gestures, every future succession would become a potential civil war, as ambitious nobles calculated whether they could gain more by supporting pretenders than by accepting legal heirs. When the First Blackfyre Rebellion erupted in 196 AC, the Westerlands' response demonstrated the military and logistical capabilities that generations of prosperity had created. Lannister forces mobilized with impressive speed and efficiency, their equipment and training reflecting decades of investment in professional military development. More importantly, their intervention in the conflict carried weight beyond simple numbers, as other houses recognized that Lannister participation indicated serious royal commitment to defeating the rebellion. The Battle of the Redgrass Field became a crucible that tested every aspect of the competing military systems that the two sides had developed. Daemon's forces relied heavily on the personal loyalty that charismatic leadership could inspire, creating armies that fought with desperate courage, but lacked the systematic coordination that characterized professional military establishments. The Loyalist forces, by contrast, demonstrated the advantages of unified command and integrated tactical planning that made individual heroism less important than collective effectiveness. The Lannister contribution to this victory extended beyond their own forces to include the logistical support that kept Loyalist armies supplied and equipped throughout the campaign. Their financial resources proved as valuable as their warriors, funding the supplies and transportation that allowed royal forces to maintain pressure on rebel strongholds until resistance collapsed. This combination of military and economic power demonstrated why the Targaryens had learned to rely so heavily on Lannister support during major crises. The death of Daemon Blackfyre at the Red Grass Field ended the immediate threat but failed to eliminate the underlying issues that had created the rebellion. His surviving sons and supporters fled to the free cities, where they established courts in exile that continued plotting their return. The Lannisters understood that this unresolved conflict would continue influencing politics for decades, requiring vigilance and preparation for future challenges. The Second Blackfire Rebellion in 211 AC demonstrated how external support could transform a defeated cause into a renewed threat. Hagon Blackfire's invasion force included not just exiled Westerosi nobles, but also foreign mercenaries and supplies provided by free city sponsors who saw opportunity in Targaryen weakness. This international dimension added complexity to what might otherwise have been treated as a purely domestic dispute. The Lannister response to this renewed threat reflected lessons learned from the previous rebellion. Rather than waiting for royal summons, they began mobilizing forces as soon as intelligence reports indicated unusual activity in the Stepstones. This proactive approach allowed them to contribute to the swift suppression of Hagon's forces before the rebellion could gain momentum or attract additional supporters who might have joined a more successful cause. The brief duration of the Second Blackfire Rebellion validated the strategic approach that the Lannisters had developed for dealing with such threats. Quick, decisive action that prevented pretenders from establishing themselves in Westerosi territory proved more effective than prolonged campaigns that gave rebellions time to spread and gain support. This understanding would influence their responses to all subsequent Blackfire threats. The Third Blackfire Rebellion in 219 AC tested royal and loyalist capabilities against a different type of threat. Daemon III Blackfire's attempt to seize power through a lightning campaign designed to capture key strategic points before effective resistance could be organized represented a more sophisticated approach than previous rebellions had attempted. Yet the infrastructure of loyal houses and royal institutions that had been strengthened after previous conflicts proved equal to this challenge as well. The Lannister intelligence networks that had been developed during the Reconstruction period following the Dance of Dragons provided crucial early warning about Daemon III's plans. This advanced knowledge allowed loyalist forces to position themselves effectively and coordinate their responses before the rebellion could achieve its initial objectives. The value of information proved as important as military strength in determining the outcome of the conflict. The reign of Aegon Vive brought new challenges that tested Lannister loyalty in different ways. The unlikely king's attempts to reduce the power of great houses and improve conditions for common people created tensions with traditional noble privileges that the Lannisters had spent centuries accumulating, yet their response demonstrated the adaptability that had always characterized their approach to changing political circumstances. Rather than opposing royal policies directly, the Lannisters found ways to support Aegon Vive's objectives while protecting their essential interests. Their investments in public works and charitable institutions demonstrated commitment to royal ideals while creating goodwill among populations that might otherwise have resented noble privilege. This approach allowed them to maintain influence while avoiding the conflicts that damaged other houses who chose more confrontational responses. The Fourth Blackfire Rebellion in 236 AC represented the last serious attempt by Daemon Blackfire's line to seize the Iron Throne through military action. By this time, the Blackfire cause had lost much of its original appeal, as the generation that remembered Daemon the Fine had largely passed away, and younger nobles had grown up under stable Targaryen rule. The rebellion's failure demonstrated that the dynasty had finally overcome the legitimacy crisis created by Aegon IV's deathbed actions. The War of the Nine Penny Kings in 260 AC marked the final chapter in the Blackfyre saga, as Meleys the Monstrous led a coalition of exiled lords and foreign adventurers in one last desperate attempt to carve out kingdoms in Westeros. The Lannister participation in the royal expedition that crushed this threat included young Tywin Lannister, whose experiences during the campaign would influence his approach to power for the rest of his life. The lessons that House Lannister learned during the Blackfyre era would prove invaluable in subsequent crises. They had discovered that loyalty to legitimate authority, while sometimes challenging in the short term, provided the foundation for long-term prosperity and influence. They had also learned that military effectiveness required not just individual courage, but systematic preparation and professional competence that could only be developed through sustained investment and careful planning. Most importantly, the Blackfyre rebellions had demonstrated the value of consistency in political relationships. Houses that changed sides based on momentary calculations often found themselves isolated and vulnerable when conflicts ended, while those that maintained steady loyalties earned the trust and rewards that came with proven reliability. This understanding would guide Lannister policy through all the challenges that lay ahead. The end of the Blackfyre threat marked the beginning of a new era in Westerosi politics, one in which the Targaryens could focus on governance rather than survival, and great houses could pursue their ambitions through service rather than rebellion. For House Lannister, this transition created opportunities to consolidate and expand the influence they had gained through decades of loyal service during the realm's most dangerous period since the Dance of Dragons. The year 260 AC brought news that would have seemed fantastical just decades earlier. Across the narrow sea, a coalition calling themselves the Band of Nine had seized control of the Stepstones, declaring themselves kings of various islands and threatening to use their position to launch invasions of mainland Westeros. Leading this unlikely alliance was Meleys Blackfyre, called the Monstrous, the last serious claimant of a line that had haunted Targaryen dreams for over 6 decades. For young Tywin Lannister, barely 18 years old, and already showing signs of the brilliance that would define his future, the royal expedition to crush this final Blackfyre threat provided his first taste of real warfare. Sailing east with forces drawn from throughout the Seven Kingdoms, he found himself part of a military adventure that would introduce him to lords and knights who would shape the next generation of Westerosi politics. The campaign itself proved almost anticlimactic after decades of Blackfyre-inspired anxiety. Meleys, despite his fearsome reputation and considerable physical prowess, commanded forces that were more impressive in concept than in reality. The Band of Nine represented a collection of exiles, sellswords, and opportunists held together by dreams of easy conquest rather than genuine military capability. When faced with organized resistance from professional armies, their coalition dissolved with surprising speed. Yet the relationships formed during this campaign would prove far more significant than the military victory itself. Tywin found himself serving alongside Aerys Targaryen, the king's second son, beginning a friendship that would ultimately shape the course of Westerosi history. The future Aerys II seemed everything a prince should be: intelligent, charismatic, and possessed of genuine interest in the welfare of his future subjects. Their partnership during the Stepstones campaign created bonds that both men assumed would last their entire lives. The return from this successful expedition brought Tywin home to the Westerlands at a moment when his family's reputation was beginning to suffer from problems that his father seemed incapable of addressing effectively. Titus Lannister embodied virtues that would have served him well as a maester or septon, but proved disastrous for a man who needed to command respect through strength rather than inspire affection through kindness. The fundamental issue was not that Titus lacked intelligence or good intentions. He possessed both in abundance, along with a genuine desire to be beloved by his subjects and peers. Yet in the harsh realities of Westerosi politics, where authority depended on the credible threat of consequences for disobedience, kindness without accompanying strength was interpreted as weakness that invited exploitation. The early signs of trouble appeared in seemingly minor incidents that individually seemed insignificant but collectively suggested dangerous trends. Tytos began extending loans without adequate security, accepting promises from borrowers whose creditworthiness was questionable at best. When payments were missed, he accepted excuses and extended deadlines rather than demanding immediate settlement. Word of such leniency spread throughout the realm, attracting unscrupulous lords who saw opportunities to exploit what they perceived as Lannister weakness. The affair with Lucy Westerling represented more than personal indiscretion. It symbolized the broader problem of a lord who prioritized his own comfort over his house's reputation. That the Lord of Casterly Rock would conduct such a relationship openly, apparently oblivious to its political implications, suggested either remarkable naivety or dangerous disregard for the consequences of his actions. Either interpretation undermined confidence in his judgment among vassals who needed to trust their lord's strategic thinking. More troubling were the instances of public disrespect that Tytos tolerated from his own bannermen. When Lord Walderan Tarbeck visited Casterly Rock and openly mocked his host's policies, traditional protocol demanded immediate consequences to preserve Lannister authority. Tytos's failure to respond appropriately sent signals throughout the Westerlands that their overlord lacked either the will or the capability to maintain proper discipline. These individual failures might have been manageable if they had remained isolated incidents, but they created a pattern that encouraged further testing of Lannister resolve. Houses that had submitted to Lannister authority for generations began questioning whether such submission remained necessary. The Rains of Castamere in particular saw opportunities to advance their own position by exploiting what they perceived as declining Lannister capability. Sir Roger Rayne represented everything that made this situation dangerous for House Lannister's long-term survival. Wealthy, ambitious, and possessed of sufficient military capability to back his challenges with force, he began systematically testing the boundaries of acceptable behavior. His provocations started small, questioning Lannister decisions in public forums, delaying responses to official communications, making pointed remarks about changing times and new opportunities. The Lady of House Tarbeck, Elyn Tarbeck, née Rayne, amplified these challenges through her own provocative behavior. As Roger Rayne's sister, she carried family resentments that had been building for generations, combined with personal ambitions that conventional submission to Lannister authority would never satisfy. Her calculated insults and deliberate violations of protocol were designed to provoke responses that would either demonstrate Lannister weakness or justify more aggressive action against their overlords. Young Tywin watched these developments with growing alarm and mounting frustration. His experiences during the War of the Ninepenny Kings had shown him how effective leadership could accomplish remarkable results through clear thinking and decisive action. The contrast with his father's increasingly ineffective management of growing challenges was stark and deeply troubling for someone who understood that reputation for strength was the foundation of all political power. The financial implications of Tytos's mismanagement extended far beyond the Westerlands themselves. House Lannister's reputation for always paying their debts had been built over centuries of careful financial management and strict enforcement of contractual obligations. When word spread that the Lord of Casterly Rock was allowing major debtors to default without consequences, it undermined confidence in Lannister reliability throughout the known world. This erosion of financial credibility threatened to destroy economic relationships that had taken generations to build. Merchants who had relied on Lannister backing for major ventures began seeking alternative partners. Foreign banks that had extended credit based on Lannister guarantees started demanding additional security or higher interest rates. The intricate web of commercial relationships that generated much of the house's wealth began unraveling as partners questioned whether traditional Lannister competence still existed. The military implications were equally serious. Westerland's armies had always been among the best equipped and trained in Westeros, reflecting both the region's wealth and its lords' understanding that professional military capability was essential for maintaining their position. Yet as respect for Lannister authority declined, the willingness of vassal houses to contribute their best forces for common defense also decreased. More troubling was the impact on internal security. The Westerlands had enjoyed remarkable stability for centuries, with conflicts between vassal houses rare and banditry virtually unknown. This peace had been maintained through consistent enforcement of Lannister authority and swift resolution of disputes before they could escalate. As that authority weakened, old grievances began resurfacing, while new conflicts emerged from the perception that central control was no longer effective. The personal toll on Tywin himself was evident to anyone who knew him well. Having seen what effective leadership could accomplish, he found himself forced to watch his family's reputation deteriorate due to problems that clear thinking and decisive action could easily resolve. His attempts to counsel his father towards stronger policies were consistently rebuffed, often with suggestions that he was too young to understand the complexities of noble governance. This generational conflict reflected broader changes in Westerosi society that were creating new challenges for traditional approaches to leadership. The generation that had grown up during the prosperous later years of Jaehaerys' reign had known only peace and stability, making it difficult for them to recognize how quickly such conditions could change when underlying structures were undermined. Tytos represented this mindset, assuming that goodwill and past achievements would protect his house from the consequences of present weaknesses. Yet Tywin's experiences had taught him that political authority was never permanent and always required active maintenance. The lords he had met during the Stepstones campaign came from houses that had maintained their positions through constant vigilance and willingness to take decisive action when challenged. The contrast with his father's passive approach to mounting problems was becoming increasingly difficult to tolerate. The situation with the Rains and Tarbecks escalated throughout the early 260s as both houses interpreted Lannister inaction as permission for increasingly bold challenges. Their provocations moved beyond verbal insults and financial irregularities to include territorial disputes and interference with Lannister administrative functions. Each successful challenge encouraged further testing, creating a dynamic that could only end in either complete Lannister submission or violent confrontation. By 267 AC, the crisis had reached proportions that threatened the fundamental basis of Lannister power in the Westerlands. Other vassal houses were watching carefully to see whether their overlords would finally respond to challenges that had grown too obvious to ignore. The failure to act decisively would signal that centuries of Lannister dominance were ending, inviting every ambitious lord to pursue his own interests without regard for traditional obligations. For Tywin, this approaching crisis represented both a catastrophe and an opportunity. The catastrophe lay in watching everything his ancestors had built being destroyed by his father's weakness and indecision. Yet the opportunity existed to demonstrate that the next generation of Lannister leadership would not tolerate such challenges, potentially restoring house authority through decisive action that would be remembered for generations. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether House Lannister could recover from the damage that weak leadership had caused. The outcome would depend on whether Tywin could find ways to circumvent his father's authority and take the actions that survival demanded, or whether the Golden Lions would join the ranks of once great houses that had fallen due to their own internal failures. The raven that summoned Tywin Lannister to King's Landing arrived at Casterly Rock on a grey morning in early 262 AC. Bearing news that would forever alter the trajectory of both his life and the Seven Kingdoms themselves. Prince Aerys Targaryen, newly crowned as Aerys II following his father's unexpected death, had chosen his young friend from the Stepstones campaign to serve as his hand. At barely 20 years old, Tywin would become the youngest man ever to hold the second most powerful position in the realm. The appointment shocked the great houses who had expected the new king to choose someone with decades of experience in royal governance. Yet those who had witnessed the partnership between Aerys and Tywin during their military service understood the logic behind this seemingly reckless decision. The young prince had seen firsthand how Tywin's analytical mind could identify solutions that escaped more experienced but less flexible thinkers. For Tywin himself, the appointment represented both vindication and overwhelming responsibility. Here was an opportunity to implement the principles of effective governance that his father seemed incapable of understanding, but on a scale that encompassed the entire realm rather than just the Westerlands. The position would allow him to demonstrate that intelligence and determination could achieve results that traditional approaches had failed to produce. The initial skepticism that greeted his appointment transformed rapidly into grudging respect as Tywin began implementing reforms that addressed problems which had festered for years under previous administrations. His approach to royal finances was characteristically systematic, beginning with comprehensive audits that revealed the true scope of crown debts and identifying revenue sources that previous masters of coin had overlooked or mismanaged. The financial reforms that followed demonstrated both the scope of the problems he had inherited and the effectiveness of methodical solutions properly implemented. Crown debts that had accumulated over decades were systematically addressed through a combination of improved tax collection, reduced unnecessary expenditures, and renegotiated terms with creditors who discovered that the new hand was willing to honor legitimate obligations while ruthlessly eliminating fraudulent claims. More importantly, Tywin established administrative procedures that would prevent the recurrence of such financial chaos. Regular auditing requirements, standardized accounting methods, and clear chains of responsibility created systems that functioned effectively, regardless of the competence of individual officials. These innovations reflected his understanding that sustainable governance required institutional capabilities rather than dependence on exceptional individuals. The early success of these reforms earned Tywin credibility throughout the royal court and beyond, as lords who had grown accustomed to royal weakness discovered that effective leadership could indeed produce remarkable results. Yet even as he was establishing his reputation in King's Landing, crisis was brewing in his ancestral homeland that would test his ability to manage multiple challenges simultaneously. The situation with houses Rain and Tarbeck had deteriorated beyond the point where traditional diplomatic solutions remained viable. Both houses had interpreted House Lannister's continued passivity as confirmation that the age of Lannister dominance was ending, encouraging them to pursue increasingly aggressive policies that challenged the fundamental basis of Westerland's governance. Their provocations had moved from verbal insults to armed defiance, creating conditions that demanded immediate and decisive response. Roger Rain's occupation of disputed mining territories represented a direct challenge to Lannister authority that could not be ignored without inviting similar actions from other ambitious vassals. His sister's public mockery of Lannister weakness had emboldened other houses to question their traditional obligations, while their combined debts to House Lannister had grown to levels that made eventual confrontation inevitable, regardless of political considerations. For Tywin, managing this crisis while fulfilling his responsibilities as hand required careful coordination that tested every aspect of his organizational capabilities. He could not simply abandon his royal duties to address family problems, yet he also could not allow the challenges to his house's authority to continue without response. The solution required delegating royal responsibilities while maintaining sufficient oversight to ensure continued effectiveness. The decision to request leave from King's Landing to handle administrative matters in the Westerlands provided the necessary flexibility while avoiding public acknowledgement of the crisis that was developing. This approach protected both royal prestige and Lannister reputation while creating opportunities for decisive action without external interference or premature publicity. The speed with which Tywin mobilized forces once he returned to the Westerlands demonstrated the advantages of systematic preparation and professional military organization. Unlike the feudal levy systems that characterized most regional armies, the forces he assembled represented a carefully planned combination of professional soldiers and reliable vassal contingents that could execute complex operations with minimal coordination difficulties. The campaign against House Tarbeck served as both military objective and strategic demonstration. Tarbeck Hall's destruction needed to be swift and complete, eliminating any possibility of future challenges, while providing an unmistakable example of the consequences that awaited those who defied Lannister authority. The operation's success would determine whether other potential rebels would reconsider their positions or whether the crisis would escalate into broader conflict. The assault on Tarbeck Hall revealed the tactical innovations that Tywin had developed through careful study of military history and personal experience during the Stepstones campaign. Rather than conducting a traditional siege that might have lasted months, he employed coordinated attacks that overwhelmed defensive positions through superior coordination and concentration of force. The castle fell within days, its defenders either dead or scattered. More importantly, the systematic destruction that followed sent clear messages about the new reality of Lannister governance. Every member of House Tarbeck was eliminated, preventing future attempts to revive their claims or seek vengeance for their defeat. The castle itself was demolished so thoroughly that nothing remained to serve as a rallying point for potential supporters, while Tarbeck lands were redistributed to houses that had remained loyal during the crisis. Yet even this decisive action paled in comparison to the innovative solution that Tywin devised for dealing with House Rain and their stronghold of Castamere. The ancient castle had been carved directly into a hillside, with extensive underground chambers and passages that made traditional siege warfare virtually impossible. Previous attempts to capture similar fortifications had required years of investment with uncertain prospects for success. Tywin's engineering solution demonstrated the type of creative thinking that would characterize his entire approach to seemingly impossible problems. Rather than attempting to breach Castamere's defenses directly, he ordered the diversion of nearby streams and rivers to flood the underground chambers where the Rains had taken refuge. The operation required sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering and careful coordination of massive construction projects. The execution of this plan created one of the most memorable events in Westerosi military history. As water began flowing into Castamere's depths, the trapped Rains found themselves facing a death that was both inevitable and symbolic. They had sought to undermine Lannister authority from their underground stronghold, only to discover that their refuge had become their tomb. The rising waters eliminated every member of the house, ensuring that no future claimants could challenge the new order. The commissioning of the Rains of Castamere to commemorate this victory represented perhaps Tywin's most brilliant innovation in psychological warfare. The song served multiple purposes simultaneously, celebrating Lannister victory, warning potential enemies about the consequences of defiance, and creating a cultural artifact that would spread the story throughout the realm without requiring official proclamation or explanation. The song's effectiveness exceeded even Tywin's expectations, as it rapidly became popular throughout Westeros among both nobles and common people. Its haunting melody and memorable lyrics made it easy to learn and difficult to forget, while its underlying message was clear enough that even the most obtuse listener could understand the implications. Future generations would associate the song with Lannister power, creating psychological associations that served as effective deterrents against potential challenges. The immediate aftermath of these campaigns demonstrated the effectiveness of decisive action in restoring political authority. Every Westerlands house that had shown signs of wavering loyalty immediately renewed their pledges of allegiance, while those that had remained faithful throughout the crisis found their positions strengthened through Tywin's favor. The speed of this transformation validated his belief that clear demonstrations of strength were more effective than patient diplomacy in managing ambitious vassals. The convenient timing of Titus Lannister's death in 267 AC eliminated the last obstacle to Tywin's complete authority over his ancestral lands. While officially the result of natural causes, the timing suggested that the stress of watching his life's work, corrected through methods he had consistently rejected, may have contributed to his final decline. His passing allowed Tywin to assume full lordship without the complications that divided authority had created. The return to King's Landing as both Hand of the King and Lord of Casterly Rock marked the beginning of a new phase in Tywin's career, one in which he could pursue his vision of effective governance without the constraints that family obligations had previously imposed. His success in resolving the Westerlands crisis while maintaining his royal responsibilities had demonstrated capabilities that even his supporters had not fully anticipated. The reputation that these achievements created would influence every subsequent aspect of Tywin's relationship with both the Iron Throne and the realm's great houses. He had proven that youth need not be a barrier to effectiveness, that creative solutions could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and that decisive action could restore order where patient diplomacy had failed. These lessons would guide his approach to the challenges that lay ahead as he began the most influential period of his remarkable career. The decade following Tywin's consolidation of power in the Westerlands marked the true golden age of his partnership with Aerys II, a period when their combined abilities created the most effective royal government that the Seven Kingdoms had experienced since the early years of Jaehaerys II. The realm prospered under their joint leadership in ways that seemed to validate every principle of intelligent governance that Tywin had developed throughout his young life. The administrative innovations implemented during this period established standards that would influence royal governance for generations. Tywin's systematic approach to problem-solving transformed departments that had operated according to ancient custom into efficient organizations capable of managing the complex challenges that governing 7 diverse kingdoms required. Royal correspondence that had once taken months to process was handled within days, while legal disputes that had previously festered for years were resolved through streamlined procedures that served justice while maintaining stability. The economic policies of this era reflected Tywin's understanding that royal strength depended ultimately on the prosperity of the realm's productive classes. Rather than simply maximizing tax revenues through increasingly burdensome levies, he implemented systems that encouraged trade and investment while ensuring that royal finances remained stable. The infrastructure projects funded during this period created employment for common people while improving the transportation networks that facilitated commerce throughout Westeros. The great roads constructed under Tywin's direction rivaled anything that had been built since the days of Valyrian engineering. These highways connected distant regions more effectively than ever before, reducing the time and cost required for moving goods between major markets, while facilitating the rapid movement of royal forces when military action became necessary. The investment in transportation infrastructure demonstrated understanding of how physical improvements could generate long-term economic and political benefits. Military reforms implemented during this golden period created professional standards that transformed the royal forces from a collection of feudal levies into something approaching a modern army. Standardized training procedures, improved equipment specifications, and systematic promotion policies ensured that competence rather than birth determined advancement within the military hierarchy. These changes enhanced both the effectiveness of royal forces and the loyalty of soldiers who recognized that merit would be rewarded regardless of their social origins. The intelligence networks that Tywin established throughout the realm provided early warning about potential threats while creating mechanisms for monitoring the effectiveness of royal policies in distant regions. This information-gathering capability proved invaluable in maintaining stability, as problems could be identified and addressed before they escalated into serious challenges to royal authority. The investment in systematic intelligence represented one of Tywin's most important contributions to the long-term security of Targaryen rule. Yet even as these successes mounted, careful observers began noticing troubling changes in King Aerys' personality and judgment. The transformation was gradual at first, manifesting as occasional outbursts of temper or inexplicable decisions that contradicted his previously consistent behavior. Tywin initially attributed these incidents to the stress of kingship, assuming that rest and careful management would restore his friend's equilibrium. The defiance of Duskendale in 277 AC marked the crucial turning point that would ultimately destroy the partnership between king and hand. Lord Darkland's rebellion might have been suppressed quickly through conventional military action, but his decision to hold King Aerys as hostage created a crisis that required the most delicate handling. Any miscalculation could result in the king's death and the collapse of the entire governmental system that their partnership had created. Tywin's response to this crisis demonstrated both his strategic brilliance and his genuine concern for Aerys' welfare. Rather than attempting a direct assault that might have triggered the king's execution, he orchestrated a careful campaign of psychological pressure and selective military action that gradually isolated Darkland's supporters while offering face-saving alternatives to continued resistance. The eventual rescue succeeded in preserving the king's life while eliminating the threat to royal authority. Yet the months of captivity had profoundly damaged Aerys' mental state in ways that would prove irreversible. The experience of helplessness and humiliation had awakened paranoid tendencies that gradually consumed his personality, transforming the intelligent and charismatic young king into an increasingly unpredictable tyrant obsessed with perceived threats to his authority. The friend that Tywin had known since their youth effectively ceased to exist, replaced by a stranger whose fears and suspicions made rational governance increasingly impossible. The deterioration of their relationship occurred gradually over several years, as Aerys' growing paranoia focused increasingly on the competence and popularity that had made Tywin such an effective hand. The king began interpreting his servant's successes as evidence of disloyalty, viewing Tywin's reputation for effectiveness as a threat to royal prestige, rather than an asset that enhanced the crown's authority throughout the realm. The systematic undermining of policies that had proven successful reflected Aerys' growing inability to distinguish between genuine threats and imaginary conspiracies. Projects that had generated prosperity and stability were abandoned or reversed based on suspicions that their success somehow diminished royal authority. The efficient administrative systems that had made governance more effective were disrupted through arbitrary changes that served no purpose beyond demonstrating that the king retained ultimate power over his servants. The personal insults that Aerys began directing toward Tywin represented more than simple rudeness. They were calculated attempts to humiliate a man whose competence had become a source of royal resentment. The rejection of Cersei's proposed betrothal to Prince Rhaegar was accompanied by crude suggestions about Tywin's fitness to father royal grandchildren, while public criticisms of past policies were designed to undermine the Hand's reputation among nobles who had come to respect his judgment. These provocations tested Tywin's self-control in ways that few previous challenges had managed. His entire approach to power had been based on earning respect through demonstrated competence, making it particularly difficult to tolerate public attacks on his reputation and judgment. Yet his loyalty to the institution of the monarchy, if not to Aerys personally, kept him in his position longer than personal pride might otherwise have permitted. The final break came in 281 AC when Aerys' behavior crossed boundaries that even Tywin's legendary patience could not tolerate. The specific incident that triggered his resignation has been recorded differently by various sources, but all agree that it involved personal humiliation so severe that continuing to serve would have compromised not just Tywin's dignity but his effectiveness as a political leader. The accumulated grievances of years had reached a point where resignation became preferable to continued service under impossible conditions. The manner of Tywin's departure from King's Landing demonstrated the controlled anger that characterized his response to the destruction of their partnership. Rather than engaging in public recriminations or dramatic gestures, he simply announced his intention to return to Casterly Rock and departed with minimal ceremony. The understated nature of his resignation was itself a form of criticism, suggesting that the situation had become so intolerable that explanation was unnecessary. The immediate consequences of Tywin's resignation became apparent throughout the realm, as the efficient governmental systems he had created began deteriorating under less competent management. Royal finances, which had been stabilized through careful attention to detail, quickly returned to their previous chaotic state. Administrative departments that had functioned smoothly under systematic oversight became mired in bureaucratic inefficiency and petty corruption. The return to Casterly Rock allowed Tywin to focus on consolidating Lannister power in preparation for the conflicts he recognized were becoming inevitable. His years of royal service had provided unparalleled insight into the strengths and weaknesses of the Targaryen system, knowledge that would prove invaluable when civil war finally erupted. The military and economic preparations he undertook during this period reflected his understanding that effective neutrality required the capability to intervene decisively when the optimal moment arrived. The outbreak of Robert's rebellion in 282 AC created the crisis that Tywin had been anticipating since his resignation. Harys's execution of Lord Rickard Stark and his heir Brandon was the final act of madness that convinced even loyal houses that the king had become a threat to the stability of the realm itself. Yet Tywin's response demonstrated the calculating patience that had always characterized his approach to major decisions. Rather than immediately joining the rebellion, he adopted a position of strategic neutrality that allowed him to assess the relative strengths of the competing sides while preserving Lannister flexibility for whatever outcome emerged. This approach frustrated both rebels and loyalists, who sought his immediate commitment, but it reflected sophisticated understanding that premature decisions often led to irreversible mistakes. The careful analysis that guided Tywin's eventual decision to support Robert Baratheon considered factors that extended far beyond simple military calculations. He recognized that Aerys's madness had made stable governance impossible regardless of who won the immediate conflict, while Robert's youth and inexperience created opportunities for experienced advisors to shape the policies of a new dynasty. Most importantly, the rebellion's success seemed increasingly certain following the Battle of the Trident, making continued neutrality politically dangerous. The timing of Lannister intervention in the war demonstrated the strategic patience that had characterized Tywin's entire approach to the crisis. His forces arrived at King's Landing only after Robert's victory had become inevitable, allowing him to claim credit for the dynasty's triumph while minimizing the costs and risks associated with prolonged military involvement. This perfectly calculated intervention positioned House Lannister as indispensable allies of the new regime, rather than opportunistic supporters seeking to benefit from royal weakness. The sack of King's Landing and the elimination of remaining Targaryen claimants represented perhaps the most controversial decisions of Tywin's entire career. Yet they reflected his understanding that successful dynastic transitions required the complete elimination of rival claims that might inspire future rebellions. The murders of Prince Rhaegar's children, while brutal, ensured that Robert's reign would not be haunted by Targaryen pretenders seeking to restore their family's rule. The presentation of the slain children to Robert Baratheon served multiple purposes simultaneously. It demonstrated Lannister commitment to the new dynasty in the most unambiguous terms possible, while also establishing Tywin's willingness to take responsibility for necessary but distasteful actions that others might have avoided. The symbolic impact of this gesture was enormous, creating bonds of complicity that would tie the new king to his Lannister supporters for the remainder of his reign. The marriage alliance between Cersei and Robert that followed represented the culmination of Tywin's long-term strategy for maintaining Lannister influence regardless of which dynasty controlled the Iron Throne. This union positioned his house as partners rather than subjects in the new governmental system, ensuring that Lannister interests would be protected while creating opportunities for his descendants to shape royal policy for generations to come. The final triumph that these achievements represented validated every principle that had guided Tywin's approach to power throughout his remarkable career. From the young man who had crushed rebellion in the Westerlands to the Hand who had governed the realm more effectively than any of his predecessors, he had demonstrated that intelligence, determination, and strategic patience could overcome any obstacle and achieve any objective. The transformation of House Lannister from regional lords to the true powers behind the Iron Throne represented the completion of a process that had begun with Lann the Clever's conquest of Castamere Rock thousands of years earlier. Each generation had built upon the achievements of their predecessors, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining the core principles that had always guided their house. Tywin's generation had simply carried this process to its logical conclusion, achieving dominance that exceeded anything their ancestors had imagined possible. As the reign of Robert Baratheon began with Lannister gold flowing into royal coffers and Lannister influence shaping royal policies, the Golden Lions could reflect on a rise to power that had taken millennia to complete, but had ultimately proven unstoppable. They had survived conquest by dragons, civil wars between dragons, the extinction of dragons, and the madness of kings, emerging stronger from each crisis through the application of intelligence and adaptability that had become their defining characteristics. The price of this supremacy was written in the blood of children and the ashes of burned castles. Yet from Tywin's perspective, these costs were merely the necessary consequences of playing the Game of Thrones to win rather than simply to survive. House Lannister had indeed always paid their debts, and the debt they owed to history was the creation of a dynasty that would endure regardless of whatever challenges the future might bring.